Good morning. We are thrilled you all came out on this snowy day in the middle of winter to have our first speaker series of 2019. I'm Diane Johnson. I'm the Vice President of Institutional Advancement, and we are thrilled to see you. I want to take an opportunity first, since it's the start of the year and we just finished up 2018, to thank all of you as members. This past year we accomplished a lot at the garden. From an institutional advancement perspective, we want you to know as members that we appreciate all the contributions that came in. For the first time ever, the garden went over $4 million in general membership. That's significant. And thank you. It's due to you. And if you are a donor in some of our upper-level recognition societies, that was an additional 2.1. So we really had a good year. We still want more growth. As always, you know, there's always needs at the garden, but we really appreciate everything you all do, both the attendance that you bring as well as the support that you deliver. And part of it, the support, allows us to do things like the speaker series and feature some of our prominent scientists and horticulturists and others. In a few short weeks, we will be opening our annual orchid show, which is a wonderful thing in the middle of winter, right, for all of us to get a little bit of refresh and feel a little bit of warmth and sunshine. This year's show will kick off with an exclusive member preview on Friday, February 1st at 7 p.m. Hope you can join us for that fun night. It will feature live music, a cash bar, and a chance to meet our orchid experts. Reservations are not required. Simply bring your membership card for free entry. The following morning on Saturday, February 2nd at 11 a.m., we will be right back here in the theater for a speaker series about the orchid show, featuring MBG staffers Babs Wagner and Pat Skase. I think many of you know both of those wonderful women. As with all speaker series programs, reservations are required, and we'd really strongly encourage you to call in and do that. You can also just stop by the membership desk today and reserve a spot. Later in February, as part of the speaker series, we will be screening a very special film called 5 Seasons. This critically acclaimed documentary focuses on the incredible life and work of Peter Uloft, the revolutionary landscape designer behind such famous projects as New York City's High Line and the Lurie Garden in Chicago's Millennium Park. We will be screening this twice, on February 26th at 11 a.m. and again on February 27th at 7 p.m. So that will be our February speaker series. It's now my pleasure to focus in on what you came here for today, which is to welcome Andrew Wyatt to our speaker series stage. Andrew joined the garden staff in 2011 as Vice President of Horticulture and Living Collections, and he is now the Senior Vice President in that position at the garden. Andrew leads a staff of more than 60 horticulturists who maintain the garden's 79 acres. Prior to coming to the garden, Andrew held positions at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden, the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, the Chicago Botanic Garden, and the University of Oxford Botanic Garden. Andrew is recognized as a leader in his field in both living collections and botanical garden management. And the garden is very fortunate to have him overseeing our collection, as well as all of us getting to work with him as a colleague. Please join me in welcoming Andrew today to kick off this year's speaker series. Andrew Wyatt.
Okay, so it's the first time I'm wearing this microphone. If you can't hear me, I'm British, so if you can't hear me and I'm mumbling, just wave and I'll speak louder. So there's a question of whether I look like a 1980s aerobics instructor or Steve Jobs. So take whichever one you want. We're here today to talk about horticulture and living collections, and some of the technical aspects behind that, and why we make some of the decisions that we make, and what you're seeing and going to see in the garden going forward. And I'm going to take you through a little bit of history of gardens as well, and what is a botanic garden, and how botanic gardens came about, and how that references what we do here at the Missouri Botanical Garden. So, what is a botanical garden? Botanic gardens are institutions that are holding documented collections of living plants for science, conservation, education, and display. And the core thing is documented collections of living plants. So this is a definition that you can see that Dr. Peter Weiss-Jackson generated while he was at the BGCI. It is the world's accepted definition of what a botanic garden is. So in essence, we're talking about the plants being the central aspect of what a botanic garden is and does. And you'll see in a couple of the other slides, I'm going to talk about the difference between a botanical garden and other institutions and how that they handle, say, research or education. So it's about the plants, and I'm here to hopefully persuade you, and hopefully you're already on board, that it is about these things that we're talking about here at the garden. And this is the core of what we do at the Missouri Botanic Garden, and indeed any botanical garden. So everything comes through the plants. And so we're a collections-based institutions. We hold and document thousands and thousands of species. And just like any other museum, we track and record these plants, and we have the ability to integrate research. And so some of the core botanic gardens, like us, we have the ability to do taxonomic research, horticultural research, and we are able to then deliver that through the plant collections to the public. So it's this integration of all of these pieces that make botanic gardens very, very strong entities as far as being able to deliver our mission. And the plants that we use to do that in the displays are there for engagement for the public. Botanic gardens have elements of all of these things. I'm going to move this mic here a little bit closer. Yeah, that's better. So I moved it closer, so that's going to work a lot better. So botanic gardens have elements of all of these different things, but we're not any single one of these. We're not a display garden. We're not a Longwood. Longwood's focus is on pure display. We're not Longwood Gardens. We hold collections for research and conservation, and so we have a guiding mission to what we do. So that guiding mission dictates what we can do and what we achieve and what you see in the garden's displays. So we're not totally a display garden. We have elements of it. We have annual displays. We have beautiful displays in the garden for people to enjoy, but that's not our primary focus. It is one of our focus. We're not a university. Universities do research. We do research. Universities do research without plant collections. We have plant collections. We have herbarium specimens. We are a botanical garden. We have these museum. We are a museum. We have these things that we work on. So we're not necessarily a research institution, but we have components of research that make us part of a botanic garden is. We're not a park. We do. Everybody, including the horticulture staff, do enjoy walking through the garden. We do have that recreation component and being able to enjoy the environment, but that's not our sole purpose. We're not just a park. We're a park housing mission elements, plants that support our larger mission. We have the Shore Nature Reserve. But we're not a national park or a state park or a reserve. It comes back to the plants of the central, and being the central piece of what we do, and how that relates to the mission itself. Sorry, these things. I wouldn't make a very good aerobics instructor, apparently. Okay, I think it's going to work now. Steve Jobs never had these problems. Okay, so we're not necessarily, reserves do conservation, but we're not necessarily totally a reserve, right? We have that as an element of what we do, but again, it is the collections, the plants, the research, the herbarium specimens, the plant collections that enable us to be a botanical garden. So what are we talking about when we're talking about a living collection? So we all see the garden and appreciate the garden for its beauty and displays, but I would like to persuade all of you to think about the garden from the perspective of these as individual elements of the garden, because it's the way that I see them, and it's the way that a lot of our horticulturists are seeing them, and the way that we're developing the collections. We're not necessarily seeing the garden as entire landscapes. We're seeing them as made up of components of very, very important specimens, and then we're landscaping from that perspective. And that's a very, very important distinction for botanic gardens, because we need to be able to make sure that every single element that goes into the garden is highly mission related. And so so when you see some of the restrictions and some of the ways that we handle things, you'll see that is the reason why we make some of the decisions that we make here at the garden. So what is a living collection? It's seeds in our seed bank. They are living collections. They are just waiting to grow. And seeds in the seed bank are very important for us because we are able to hold mass diversity in the seed bank, whereas we can't necessarily in the living collections. So the seed bank is a key, important piece of the garden's collections, which I'll talk a little bit about later, but it is a key part of our living collections. Seedlings and vegetative material in micropropagation. What is micropropagation, you may ask? It's propagation of either seed or meristematic cells in agar jelly in a lab-controlled situation. So some plants you can't grow from seed or traditional methods. We're able to grow them in a lab. Orchids are a classic example here. Because the seed is so small, oftentimes they need a symbiotic relationship with fungi to grow, and you can only do that in a lab setting. And so this is a key part of our living collections, plants in jars that we can then bring out and then put into the living collection. So it's a way for us to grow and hold plants. So another key component. We have shelves of tubers down in the basement. The public doesn't necessarily get to see these, but if you've heard Derek talk about the water lily collections, a lot of our tropical water lily collections sit in these for years, and then we rotate them through the displays. That's part of our living collections. It's behind the scenes, but it is supporting the displays that we have on display at the garden here. And then of course what you see every day, which is the garden itself, the growing plants in the garden, and this is the piece that really interacts as the window for the public to be able to understand what we have in the collections and understand the beauty of the plants that we have in the garden. And so all of these elements work to be the permanent living collections. What we do not accession into permanent living collections, although they are a part of our display aspect of our garden, is the annuals. These do not get tracked as far as living collections. So every single plant you see on the table here, it has an accession like an art museum would have. It has a unique number when it comes into the garden, and it's tracked through a database, and it's tracked the entirety of its life, all the way through propagation and then onto the garden's grounds. So we track almost 17,000 taxa, so you can imagine the amount of work that goes into tracking these things, and I'll talk about why that's important a little bit later in the presentation. But we do not track annuals, and the reason we do not track annuals is because they breed and they move around, and we can't be ensured that that is the original genetic material. And so we do annual displays like these for display, for beauty of plants and for education, but it's a slice of the garden's mission, but not necessarily all of the garden's mission. So enjoy the annual displays, but these are the permanent plant collections. So what is conservation horticulture? We do not do standard horticulture. I will talk about this a lot, and I think there is a big difference between what commercial horticulture is and what maintenance horticulture for home landscapes is and what botanical horticulture is. I've studied botanical horticulture my entire life, and managing living collections is very, very different. Botanic garden horticulture is very different than any other forms of horticulture. And so we take all of these categories into consideration. We're looking at conservation genetics, we're looking at rarity assessment, we're looking at soils, we're looking at taxonomy and floristics, we're looking at species discovery data when we're thinking about our horticulture. And I'll show you some examples of botanic garden displays that take all these into consideration. And that is what is now known as conservation horticulture. This used to be a term when I was in college some years ago. It was they used to say that I look young for my position. I don't get that anymore, unfortunately. This used to be called botanical horticulture. So the core modern term for it, the cool term, is conservation horticulture. And so all of these things come out of conservation horticulture, and I will keep reiterating it's about the plant, right? We're here for the plants, and we're here to create that connection between plants and you guys and the public. And so we create and manage living collections. We protect large diversity of plants, and we grow and protect large amounts of diversity of plants in the living collection itself. We create propagation and cultivation protocols to document our knowledge, and we incorporate these collections in a way that we can actually engage the public with them. So I want to take you back to the beginning of botanical gardens, and we can talk about why botanic gardens are what they are and how they came to be. So really what we think of as a modern botanic garden arose during the Renaissance period. So people have been collecting information on plants, and some of the first documented information on plants goes all the way back to the ancient Rome, where they started to document and understand plants, organize societies. You've got some of the first plant collections documented in the ancient pyramids in Giza you can see them, they're carved into the stones in these hieroglyphs of moving date palms into place for these avenues. And so we start to see, as societies start to gain larger societies and knowledge, that they start to record and track information on plants. So we've got that, but as the Roman Empire died out, then horticulture starts to retreat into churches and smaller villages, and a lot of times the use of plants were basically outside. So people would go into the forest and use plants, and they wouldn't necessarily bring them back. So the first horticulture was really bringing plants back for cultivation for home use, right? You don't want to walk into the forest every time you want some herbs and spices. You want to be able to get it outside your front door, similar to we do today, right? We put the important plants that we want outside the kitchen and the patio so that we can actually reach them. So that was the first beginning of plants into gardens. And this is an amazing garden, and I'll talk a little bit about it later, but this is Padua. And so some of the first gardens started in 1544 and 1545 in Italy. As the Renaissance, the understanding of science came about, the understanding of plants also were in part of that wave as well. And so you start to begin to see these botanic gardens, and most of them were connected to universities, beginning to understand and document the science behind plants. And they were there to study something called Horti Simplicium. What is Horti Simplicium? It's the simple plants. Not simple plants as in simple plants. I don't believe there are any simple plants. But Horti Simplicium is basically herbs and spices, and those plants used for medical uses. So these were what they called the known plants at the time. And so that was the goal of most of the early botanical gardens, were to have these plants of human use in the gardens that were then used for research of medical purposes. So if we basically look at what the categorizations of how botanic gardens have developed, and these are just, and lots of people could disagree with me on some of the major drivers, but these are what I would consider some of the major drivers of what spurned the actual development of botanic gardens across the globe. So early in their history, it was the Renaissance, the understanding of medical plants, and then we've got 1600 to 1800, and some of these overlap, but you've got the exploration of crops and herbs and medical plants from across the globe. So empire is now considered rather bad, but basically a lot of the European empires would go out and they would collect herbs and spices from around the world. Indonesia, for example, the Dutch, the British, of course, India, Portugal, of course, South America, and they would bring these plants back into cultivation. And so a lot of the gardens that developed around the globe actually developed as experimental stations to actually introduce plants into cultivation. And many gardens on tropical islands in the Caribbean, in Mauritius, actually developed as way stations to actually take these plants and bring them back into cultivation. So it was a major driver early on in botanic gardens development. Empire is bad, yes, I can say that. In British, we've learned from our mistakes. But we understand that was a major driver in introduction of crop species into living collections. And then we've got the taxonomy and understanding and categorization of plants as more plant diversity was uncovered. You've got living collections taking a major role in understanding that. And today, why you hear us talking about so much about plant conservation is we're shifting all of those research and knowledge resources that we built up over all of those years into conserving plant species across the globe, because it is critically important. So those are some of the major drivers. Today, we have over 3,000 botanic gardens across the globe, so every one of these little blue dots is a botanical garden. You can see you can't throw a stone in Europe without hitting one, and the same in the eastern United States. So early on, before the Renaissance, you were talking about making guesses on plant use. So you know, how on earth did people understand how to use plants? So did Bob try the red tomato first? You know, Kevin tried that one last week. He's no longer here, so try the green one. You know, so you know, you've got these guesses, and part of it is mythology and witchcraft, and it comes from that area of paganism, and you've got all of these pieces coming in, inference of what these plants are about. This is Pulmonaria. Pulmonaria looks like a lung, so you can see it's called the lungwort in its common name, and so because it looked like a lung, the inference is it's going to cure lung afflictions. Is that true? Not really. They still use it for that nowadays based on that information, but there's no documented science that it actually has an effect. We've got this is deadly nightshade, Morpha belladonna, Atropha belladonna, sorry, and it looks delicious, right? Looks fantastic. It's in the Solanaceae family, same as the tomato, but it's got a compound in it called atropine, which will kill you dead. It's very, very poisonous. It's called Atropha belladonna. In Italian, belladonna is beautiful woman, and during the early Renaissance, they used it as drops women used it as drops in their eyes to increase the pupil size. And so, of course, if you put too much in your eye, you go blind. And so, so all of these things are, so understanding of plants is a critical part, right? So you've got this crossover between mysticism and herbal remedies, and then actual science coming in to understand how to use these plants. So a very exciting time at that 1544 into the 1600s, the early discovery of plant species. This plant is really interesting. This is mandrake, Mandragora officinarum, and I have one here. It's written in medieval text, and of course the mysticism goes deep because that's what the root looks like. It looks like a person, right? It's got arms and it's got legs. It is in the family Solanaceae, so it does have compounds in it as well, similar to the atropine that's in the deadly nightshade. But the key thing on this one, if you've ever watched Harry Potter, is that when and you've got kids and grandkids, and they pull the plant out and it screams, well, that's written in medieval text. That's what happens when you pull this thing out of the ground. And so when I was 13, I first potted one of these up when I first started at my first botanic garden, and the head gardener was recanting this, and he said, you know, I'm not going to touch it because I'm superstitious. You pot it up. And I'm like, oh, great. You know, you pull this thing out of the thing, you not only die, but you go to hell for pulling this thing up. So if it didn't scream, but I may still be going to hell. I don't know. So what they used to do is they used to attach 2 wild dogs to it and then run, and then let the wild dogs pull the thing up, wait until it stopped screaming, and then come back and deal with it. So this is Mandragora officinarum, which is this plant here. So anyone want to try and pull it up? No? No? Any takers? No? You don't want to go to hell? They don't scream. It's a great plant, so it's really good educationally. And then we've got plants that really came into use, like coffee and chocolate, Theobroma cocoa, and coffee really came in from experimentation as well. How on earth did people figure out, first of all, that coffee, you had to harvest and dry and then roast coffee beans? I mean, it's just trial and error, right? So these first botanic gardens were great places to bring that scientific principle, the methodology of science, to understanding plants, and that is key. It's key to what we know today. It's key to what we do today. So it's that core structure of what we do. So very exciting time in history when botanic gardens came about and were at the forefront of science. And this picture really depicts why the expansion of botanic gardens happened with fruit and crops. This is just a distribution of wild fruit and vegetables across the globe. And you can see our diets today are truly global diets. We don't eat from one single region. If we did, we'd only be eating strawberries and blueberries. And so we have all of these wonderful crops from across the globe. And that's due in part to botanic gardens and the introduction of plant species and the understanding and learning of plants and the moving of plants between different areas in the globe. And we still do this today, and it's still a portion of what botanic gardens do, is introduction, and even more so than that, the protection of that wild genes associated to a lot of these crop species are part of what we do as part of our collections. So the driver of moving these plants into cultivation was key. Now, if you're from Europe like me, I don't know, can I say I'm from Europe because of Britex? I don't know. Anyway, maybe. But if you're from Europe like me, we probably ate a lot of cabbage and Brussels sprouts, right? Well, British, we still do that. So, but you can imagine the first time that these Europeans tasted some of these spices from India and from Indonesia, you must have thought you died and gone to heaven, because the blandness of food back then was unbelievable. And so these amazing spices don't come from Europe or even North America. They come from these areas of the world here. And so it was highly, highly lucrative for these merchants that would move these crop species apart around the world and introduce these crops. To the point where it was like, to an expedition was about 400% profit on some of these spices, so it created wealth overnight. So this was the oil and gas and natural resources of the day. It wasn't oil and gas, it was plants. This was the major, major economic driver. And botanic gardens played their role in understanding and categorizing and introducing plants, and even crops like rubber. Hevea brasiliensis, from moving those around the globe and using them and growing them. This is tea, Camellia sinensis, and musa, of course, banana, and cloves, all of these things and many more. This is Peperum nigrum, black pepper. And so all of these plants were moved and tracked and recorded in botanic gardens and their use. So major, major drivers were the use of economic plants. Still today, we still conserve wild genes in plants. As plant diversity was discovered and we saw more of the world's plant diversity, the diversity of life on this planet is unbelievably amazing, as if you didn't know, right? But it is unbelievable, more so than any of us can really fathom in one idea. But as these collectors went out and saw these things, it became more so that we were collecting to understand that diversity. And all of these were part of fads of collecting, and so there was massive collections of the carnivorous plants during the Victorian period. This is Nepenthes raja, which is the largest of the Nepenthes from Mount Kinabalu in Borneo. Traps are about this big. So amazing curiosity and wanting to understand full species diversity. Pathiopedilums and orchids became a craze. So did cacti. And you can imagine Wilson coming across Lilium regali in China for the first time. This was unknown to horticulture. You come across that in a valley and you're just going, oh my gosh, that's amazing. So you can imagine this excitement of seeing this plant diversity and introducing it and understanding it, and being able to categorize it. And part of taxonomy is being able to understand how these things are related, so we can put sense and order to our world. Victoria Amazonica is another one. Davidia involucrata in China. So beautiful plant diversity became a driver and understanding in itself. And you can imagine, as horticulturists went across the globe and botanists to actually collect this stuff. This is Captain Cook's ship, the Endeavour. And so this thing circumnavigated the globe, I think, at least twice, maybe 3 times. So plants were brought back in the early Victorian periods in these, which are Wardian cases. So you'd have a horticulturist on board just to look after the plants. You couldn't guarantee that the plants were in seed when you got to the other side of the globe, so you had to bring back live specimens. So you had to keep them alive to travel 3 to 6 months across the globe to actually get them back into cultivation. So amazing lengths that botanic gardens went for collecting much of this plant material. So, and there's some really, really amazing stories of some of these collectors that went out to collect the material. We send staff all out over the globe to do different collections for the purpose of conservation and add to our living collections. And oftentimes when they come back and I say, oh, it was tough. I'm like, yeah, you couldn't get your chai latte, right? But you can imagine these early plant collectors. They got on a ship They didn't exactly know where they were going. They didn't even know if where they were going even existed. And they spent 3 to 6 months on that ship. They got off the other end. They had to collect the plant material. They got back on with their Wardian case, and then they had to keep those plants alive for 6 months to get back. So you can imagine now we get on a plane, we get to the place, and then we do hike and climb mountains and do all of the stuff that they would have done. But the logistics of doing so is so much easier nowadays. So these are examples of some of the Victorian era botanic gardens. Of course, Kew in 1749, established in 1749, was part of the British Empire. It's looking at introducing many of those plants. And this is St. Vincent Botanic Garden in the Caribbean. And this is Pamplemous's Botanic Garden in Mauritius. And these are examples of way station botanic gardens where crops were brought into and introduced into cultivation. So taxonomy in botanical gardens. And I think these displays are really, really neat. I've got to say that I really have something in my heart for family borders and understanding. So some of the first botanic gardens displays were these family borders, and they are arranged by different categories. This is Padua Botanic Garden we talked about earlier, and you saw those circular effects of the gardens. This is an amazing garden. For both of my dissertations, I wrote about managing botanic gardens and living collections, and so this botanic garden is one of the surviving botanic gardens from that era. So 1540, 1545, it's almost pristine. And so I persuaded my wife when we were on a trip to Italy that I had to stop for a day and actually see this garden. So I made my family get off the train, and she said to me, you know, you need to take some time. You should go by yourself. And I said, okay, well, you don't want to come with me? And she said, no, I need you to take some time to be with this garden because you've written about it so much. So, and I was trying to persuade her to actually let me go and see this garden. And she said, you know what, I don't need you to persuade me. I read your dissertation more than once. So she said, I know the significance of the garden. So this garden is organized by medical, so these are order beds, but they're order beds by medical use of the plants. And one of the really romantic things about botanic gardens of this period, the 1500s and 1600s, is the way that they view plants. And this is something that I would like the way that I would like all of you to view plants today as well. They appreciated every single individual specimen. And you can see that here depicted in these beds. Each one is a little stone surround that has a single plant species in it. And so what you would do in the 1500s, you would greet the plant, you would look at it, appreciate it, and you would move on to the next one, and you would appreciate it for what it was, and you would move on to the next one. So the appreciation for diversity of life and understanding of an individual specimen was key in botanic gardens at that point in time. So often we look at, and it is important that we understand landscapes, and landscapes are pretty and beautiful, and the way that we arrange plants is beautiful, but we must never lose sight of that landscapes and habitats are made up of individual plants, and that's what we need to do. Certainly for conservation, we certainly need to understand that the diversity of life in these habitats is very, very important. And so very, very neat arrangement of plants in these borders. So this was for medical use. And then we get into, this is also very neat as well, so even taxonomically, this is an order bed for aquatic plants, so quite neat. Each aquatic plant has its little border around it. And then one of my favorite gardens, because it's where I started my career, was the University of Oxford Botanic Garden. And at this point in its history, this was a system of order beds called the Bentham and Hooker system. During the Victorian time, as taxonomy progressed, Bentham and Hooker was a director at Kew, and that was the taxonomic system that was proposed at the time. And so the plants were arranged according to Bentham and Hooker. It wasn't the first arrangement of this garden. This garden was established in 1621, so it was in that period of the early botanic gardens establishment, but it changed over time towards reflecting the modern taxonomy of the day. This picture is taken from, I'm going to throw in a few personal stories here so you understand why I make the decisions that I make as well, and where I come from my love of plants. This picture is taken from the spot where I was standing when I was 8 years old, when I decided that I was going to work in botanical gardens. So I've always loved plants from the age of about 2. I can't remember anything else other than having plants around me. And I came to the greenhouses here, and my mother said, you know, you need to take him to the botanical garden, to my dad. Got to take him to the botanical garden. Oh, okay, I'll take him to the botanical garden. So we walked through the ranges are on this side and walked through out into here, and you suddenly begin to realize what botanic gardens are. They are that melding of science, education, and horticulture, growing plants. It is that perfect mixture of all of those things. I couldn't, at that point when I was an 8-year-old, I was like, oh my gosh, there is a place like this. It exists, you know, all of these pieces come together in one place. They're beautiful plant collections. There is a scientific backbone to what this is doing, and they're trying to educate people about plants. All of this stuff in one place. Woohoo, I'm going to spend a life working in botanic gardens, and here I stand today. So since I was 8 years old, that was my choice to work for botanic gardens, and I've worked for now 5 botanic gardens around the world. And so these are collections. This is back then the Caryophyllaceae, Ranunculacea collections, and they're fantastic because they were arranged in ways that you could actually put these families in one spot, and so you could learn about an individual family just by walking down the beds. And so students would come in and they would look at the different arrangements of plants, and they would understand what the characteristics of a plant family was just by looking at all of these characteristics of all of these plants gathered together. And so the foundation of my career, I came back to work at Oxford Botanic Garden when I was 13, when I first started in botanic gardens. And so sometimes when I get stuck on a plant name, I still use the same system that they would have used in 1544, the students would have used to recognize a plant. Visual mapping. You look at the beds and you understand, and you can suddenly visualize what's in those beds and be able to then pick out what the characteristics of that species is. And so it still works. It's a great system of identification of plants for students and understanding taxonomy and systematics. And then we have an example of a modified taxonomic display here. This is Cambridge Botanical Garden, and this is phylogenetics. And so the borders represent larger and smaller based on the prevalence of the plant group in evolutionary history. And so you've got variants of different systematic displays. But a core role of botanic gardens is understanding and teaching that plant science, order, taxonomy through horticulture. So why are plants, why are we talking about conservation nowadays and not other things? We still do taxonomy, right? We still conserve crop species, but one of the major drivers, the major driver of botanic gardens around the world now is conservation. This is my little game of Tetris here with endangered plant species. I was going to fill the whole page for you, but 2 things happened. It was taking me too long, and I got really depressed. So these species are all endangered and could be wiped off the face of the earth. There's been a discussion recently, I don't know whether you're familiar with David Attenborough, who was a big driver in my life at getting into botanic gardens and understanding plant diversity. He's one of the British broadcasters that does all these amazing nature shows, and you see that diversity of life and an amazing presenter. The British press were hounding on him because he decided not to talk about the dire consequences of conservation. And he said, and he was arguing back and forth, and he said, well, I don't want to scare people because if people know the truth about this stuff, then they just shut down and they can't react or do anything about the problem is too big, right? It's too scary, and people just don't want to do anything. So they'll shut themselves away and say, I can't fix that, so we're not going to do anything. And the other side of the coin was people have to know about this stuff, right? We have to be able to know about what the problem is to be able to solve it. So we're caught in a catch-22. So my goal, and I think our goal and all of our goals here at the garden, is not to shield you all from this stuff, but to tell you what the problem is and then tell you how we're going to fix it. If you don't give a solution to a problem, then it is truly a problem. If there is a solution to it, then it is no longer such a problem. So our job is to bridge that gap. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So I'm not going to shield you from what the condition that we're currently in. So today, if I was to replicate this slide, this number at the bottom here, there's 55 plants on this slide. This is the number of slides I would have to show you all of the plants that are currently endangered on the planet. So scary, right? That's around 80,000 plants. are of conservation concern. And the numbers are even worse than that, because we're talking about effects of global climate change and also habitat destruction, which could lead us to looking at anywhere between 25% and 50% of our plant species going extinct over the next 50 years. So that's a significant number. So it's not just about conserving habitat. So how are we going to do this? We can't just put borders around habitats and say, okay, these things are going to be safe. Now, and I'll give you this one example here. This is Pyrus Korczynski from a project that we're doing in Kyrgyzstan. This is Kyrgyzstan because I just picked one country, but you could pick any country. And if we put, these are actually protected areas, they're protected forest areas, but you're dealing with economic issues and problems that go beyond the ability to actually conserve these habitats. Of course, if we could put barriers up around some of these habitats and conserve the plants in situ, that's perfect, right? That's what we want to do. We want to see these untouched habitats. The only untouched habitats on our planet are places like Alaska, parts of Canada, and Siberia at this point. We've touched nearly everything. And so it's very, very difficult for us to do this. It works in some cases, but we have to do what's known as integrated conservation to be able to save some of these species. And Pyrus Korczynski is a good example because there are around about 80 that we know of left in the wild. It's stopped breeding, it's no longer flowering anymore, and so we've got to get in there horticulturally and actually propagate it through grafting for it to survive. Even if we were successful at keeping cattle out of these areas, which we can't because it's a grazing culture, the government doesn't have any way of policing some of these areas, and this isn't just Kyrgyzstan, this is other areas in the world as well. That habitat destruction would continue, and we begin to lose these species that are hanging on by the edge of their fingernails. And so horticulturally, we've got to get in there and we've got to start propagating this species up ex situ with our collections here in Missouri and helping botanic gardens in Kyrgyzstan to grow this species. And so we can't just rely on the fact that these in situ places are going to be okay. And so that's the core of horticulture, of where we come in to be able to cultivate some of these plant species. So how do living collections, horticulture and gardens actually support species conservation? We hold mass diversity of plants. And so back in the Victorian day, when all of those species were discovered, part of the idea was to get as much as you possibly can. So botanic gardens would go out and they would say, oh, we've got to have one of those, and oh, look at that, one of these and one of these. And so you've got these massive collections developing. So nowadays, we try and focus a lot more on what is actually of conservation concern, what is meaningful for research and science. But mass collections holding is still very, very important, because even in my career in botanic gardens, habitats that were once untouched have been degraded, and species that were not of conservation concern are now from those areas. So historically, gardens holding these large collections, thousands and thousands of species, actually helps to prevent extinction. Not the best way to do it, because you want to target genetic diversity now. We understand a lot more about genetics in plants now than we once did. But holding plants is well documented at stopping plants from going extinct in the wild. And of course, it's a way for us to be able to show the public the diversity of plants that exist on our planet. I firmly believe as a botanical garden that we want our children and all of the audiences to be able to see things that they would not normally be able to see in any other garden. I want all of you to come in and say, oh my gosh, look at that plant, I've never seen that before, every day. And so I think that's an important goal of what we do. We make available material to support research. And that may be conservation, taxonomic research, and so it's important that we hold collections to support this research aspect. And nowadays we're moving more into where it was, okay, straight comparison on taxonomy. Taxonomy happens mostly in herbariums now, or one of the biggest drivers now for taxonomy is genetics. And so being able to have living collections at this point to be able to do genetic studies of plants is very, very critical component of that. Understanding plant compounds. And so genetics is a major driver of what we support research with the living collection. So we have to understand and shift the collections to be able to do that. So this really is generating a new heyday for living collections in use, the ability to support research from a genetics perspective. Because like anything else, you can't, as a researcher, go across the globe every time you want to sample. You can actually come to the Missouri Botanic Garden and get a sample right here. We hold large living collections. We grow and document plants of conservation concern for recovery, and that's important too, part of our horticultural knowledge and understanding that recovery. And we interpret the need for conservation of habitats and plants through the living collections. So we show plants of conservation concern to people so that they can be actively involved in that conservation effort with the plants. Where are we focusing from the Missouri Botanic Gardens perspective? We have to focus for the outdoor collections horticulturally. We have to focus on the areas which are hardy for us. And so we're looking at areas like Central Asia, China, Japan, Russia, and Eastern Europe. These are areas of high diversity. These are diversity hotspots across the world. Diversity hotspots are important because they contain 95% of the plant species on the planet. And so if they're all crammed into these areas, that's where we've got to go to get them, right? And so not to say that we don't bring in plants from some of these other areas, but diversity hotspots are very important for us from understanding where plant diversity is and conserving it. And so we can grow plants from all of these regions. And so these are areas that we are currently developing foci in being able to go and get plants for addition to the living collections. We support areas that are strong traditionally in Missouri Botanic Gardens research. And so Missouri Botanic Gardens research has been primarily in the tropics, and so we've worked with researchers in Tanzania, we work in Mauritius and Madagascar in being able to support with our horticultural knowledge the recovery of plant species and then bring plants back into our collections to support the conservation of those species. So we have to take into consideration climate zones. This is the USDA map of climate zones. Climate zones are interesting because temperature is just one indicator. Of course, rainfall and light levels and other indicators are indicators of plants. We have to take in more than just climate zones. These are resources of rarity indication. This is the United States, and so you can see here these hot spots of rarity. This is the Appalachians, one of the hottest spots of plant diversity and rarity. And so we're in the Midwest, and so this is a lot of this flora in here is ubiquitous across the Midwest, and that's why it's not considered rare, because it's in a large block and it goes across multiple states. But you can see here this is uniqueness of flora and rarity of that flora. So I thought I'd bring you a couple of plants to show you one of the active ways that we do conservation. And this plant here is Cylindrocline commersonii. And so this plant in the wild is all the way on top of this mountain on Mauritius here. There are 10 plants left in the wild. We now have 51 in our living collections. So horticulturally, we can understand, bring the plant back, grow it, put it in displays, and then put it back into the wild as far as recovery. So it's all integrated process. So, and that integration is very, very important for us. And this is one of our new ones. I'm going to be very, very careful with this because this is not anywhere outside Tanzania other than you're the first people seeing it outside of our horticulture and science staff, other than pictures. But this is Coromia gigas, an extremely rare tree from Tanzania. There are 12 of them left in the wild. And one of the things that we're concerned about is not necessarily only collecting these species, but genetic diversity. And you can see from the seed batches of this species that this is genetic. You can see the genetic diversity in this. So when we talk about individual plants, we're talking about this individual species, but we're also talking about the genetic diversity in it for recovery as well. And so, active recovery of plant species with our horticulture is really, really important. And so building all of the mission of the garden into the garden to be able to drive the collections is very, very important. So we drive the collections, these plants, we focus and target on the plant species from these areas based on the conservation value, the research value, and build the collections from that paradigm, which then allows us to put those pieces together into beautiful displays. And I would like to say that we use emissary plants. You can see here this Pathiopedilum is critically endangered. It is beautiful, right? So there are plants which have, a lot of people will say, well, you're going to collections for conservation, and it's going to be like a weed patch. And people often say, taxonomic collections and conservation collections aren't beautiful. I'm here to tell you that that's not true. So back to that slide that we saw, you could see that many of those plants that are critically endangered are very, very beautiful. And so the goal is that we use what I call emissary plants to be able to bridge the gap. So this is an emissary plant because it's beautiful. I gave a tour to a few people behind the scenes recently, and they couldn't believe the fact that some of these plants were both beautiful and endangered. But it's beautiful. But it's beautiful. Beauty isn't a saving grace of things for conservation. So, but we can use this because we're all very visual, and we all very understand plants from that visual plane and the landscape beauty and the visual beauty. We can use these plants to bridge that gap. So we create beautiful displays in the garden with beautiful specimens, so that we can actually say that this is of conservation concern and we should save all plants, whether they are beautiful or not. But we can use these specimens in the garden to actually make that point. And so we drive the garden's collections development through the research, through the conservation value, and it allows us to produce the beautiful displays and allows us to pass that information on to the public. So mission, guiding display, guiding interpretation and education. That's the only way you can do it, to actually have a scientifically valuable, conservation valuable collection that actually integrates together. So we've got all those pieces. So remember, we're not a park, we're not a pure display garden, we are a botanical garden. And all those pieces went together to create what we are. Very, very important. So a few years ago, when I first got to the garden in 2011, Peter and I had a discussion about what we thought were the main goals of horticulture and what we needed to do to actually advance horticulture to get to the point where we were doing this as best as we possibly could in Missouri Botanical Garden. You have to make tweaks all of the time at any institution. It's research and development. It's understanding where you need to be able to do the best you possibly can. And we came up with these core goals, and in fact there were mostly three of them. One was we had to understand and develop curation capacity and a new plant record system to be able to track plants to a significant degree, to be able to actually deliver the mission of the garden through the landscape. We were in desperate need of the ability to grow plants for hardy plant capacity. We didn't have the ability to grow significant specimens in-house, and so our nurseries were really buckling at the seams. And if we wanted to be able to add in significant plant diversity into the living collections to support the mission of the garden, we needed to be able to enhance that. We understand that and one of the things that also Henry Shaw understood, that understanding knowledge in horticulture and education in horticulture was very, very important for the quality of the garden. And nowadays we see universities collapsing their horticulture programs, changing focus, and so we needed the ability to make sure that we kept horticulture training at the forefront of what we do, so that we can train our own horticulturists, but also support what botanic gardens do across the globe, so that we can actually then help with using that horticultural expertise to conserve plants, to support plant research, et cetera, et cetera. And so we thought about developing a college of horticulture. And we wanted to get out there in the field. The garden's horticulturists really hadn't been out in the field in a significant number of years. And so, to be good horticulturists, to understand how to cultivate these things, and to be able to get wild origin plant material of conservation concern, you've got to go to these places to get the plant material. You can't just pick the stuff up from Home Depot. So with that mission, that integration of the science, you can no longer just get these things from commercial sources. So, so that changes the paradigm in how we actually run the garden's horticulture. So all integrated together, diversity of plant species. And then we wanted to establish a seed bank and enhance horticulture information delivery. So these are what I call the roots of what we started on 11 years ago. So I'm going to take you through where we are today on some of these things. But first I'm going to give you a little bit of a view into how successful we've been at developing our collections. There are no flies on us. There are some, because this is Pinguicula grandiflora, which is a carnivorous plant, so it's actually eating the flies, so that's a good thing, right? So we've had a 4,000% increase in our collections of plants of conservation concern from 8 years ago. So we're better than the stock market. we have a 123% increase in the number of species in our living collections. That's just raw numbers of species. 360% increase in wild origin accessions, and 4,600 propagation protocols have been produced, and 3,000 plus new accessions are added to the garden every year now. And this is not just me, this is an effort that's been taken up by every single one of our horticulturists. We are such an integrated team. So we've got teams that are working on building databases and data tracking. We've got horticulturists that are passionate about keeping these plants alive in the garden's grounds. We've got propagators that are propagating these things. So it's been a division-wide pull in this direction to be able to support plant species and support the collections and landscapes that you see out on the garden's grounds. So I think we're doing pretty well on the collections growth. And this is not even completing some of those goals that I'll show you, and we'll part way through some of these things. So we made an effort to build a new database system to track plants. If you're dealing with plants of conservation concern for research purposes, you need to understand where they come from and all of the data associated to it. So we're data geeks as well as plant geeks, and we like to record this stuff. So the Chromia gygas on the table here, and this is the collection information for that species. So we've got all the way down to latitude and longitude. We know where it came from in the wild. We know exactly the individual specimen it came from, so that we can be able to crossbreed between the 12 known individuals, so that we can get the maximum genetic material back into the wild, alongside having the plant in our garden and being able to display it for the public. So wending those mission elements in together. So I'm proud to report we have today, 8 years later, we have the most advanced living collections management system on the planet, bar none. So we completed that goal, and we continue to develop it. So this is an area which we are world leaders in, and we put an effort into producing this system and tracking this system, and the staff in these areas are very highly skilled. And we bulked up the team to be able to use this data, track and develop plant collections. So this is an example of propagation recording. We weren't doing this 8 years ago. Horticulturists have a knack of being able to keep all this knowledge in their heads, and then of course when they move on, that knowledge is gone. So I can't tell you how many times horticulturists around the world and in different botanic gardens have repeated the same thing over and over again. We wanted to stop that. We wanted to understand and learn and be able to document that. And so we now document propagation protocols. We've produced over 4,600 of them, and it becomes really important when you're dealing with very, very critically endangered species that we know exactly that knowledge and be able to implement that and provide that to others. So we record all that data too. We target things very, very effectively now as well. So if we're moving, if the direction of botanic gardens, well, we know the direction of botanic gardens are moving towards conservation, using taxonomy and using all of this knowledge that we build up and this continuing understanding of plant diversity across our planet, and how we're bringing that into focus to be able to conserve plants with our living collections and through our knowledge. We have to be able to target those plant species around the mission of the garden to be able to put them in the garden in the first place. And so this is relatively new. Over the last few years, we've generated a team that actually does that very fact. We scour resources like genetic information, we scour floras, we scour red book information. We take taxonomic data and we put it all into these tables, and it churns out the value of a plant species that we should add to the living collection. Because every plant species in our collection is valuable, and we're expending resources on those plant species to keep them alive in our collections. And so we have to be very thoughtful about what we put in our collections. If we truly want to make a difference with our collections and be able to produce beautiful gardens, we have to compile all of that data to be able to do that for you guys. And so behind the scenes we do all this. These are endemic, means it occurs only in the countries. Vulnerable and rare, this is a rarity assessment and a score based on global rarity status. And then our team, Alana and team, have really generated these conservation scores which give us ability to say that this one is more rare than this one, so that we should concentrate on this one first. And then, of course, we overlay that horticultural information on top of that. So we say, okay, which species should we put in the seed bank? Because you guys will go, oh, look at that, versus, wow, that's amazing, look at that, it's a conservation concern. So, and we can grow it, right? So we overlay that horticultural information. It's something that we're working towards. Our horticulturists really getting into active roles in curation of this data to be able to overlay that information, to be able to put the plants in the garden and keep them alive. So we do a lot of data tracking. So this stuff happens behind the scenes in order to make make the garden's mission happen with the plants that we put in the garden. We needed a new nursery. The nursery had buckled under the pressure. We built the Kemper Center for Home Gardening in the 80s. The Ridgeway, the building we're standing on in now, went down on top of the hardy plant nursery, and so we lost our ability to grow these plants. And so if you can't grow plants, we can't add plants into the living collection, right? It's quite simple. And so we needed the ability to be able to add thousands and thousands of plants into the living collection easily. And so with that curation, the ability to then target plants, came the need for us to be able to have a nursery to be able to support the growing of these plants and the associated knowledge. Many people haven't seen this or been over there, but this is the current state of the new hardy plant nursery. So back in 2012, we got a gift from the Honors family from Manchester Road of this greenhouse, and they were going out of business, and they gave us the greenhouse structure. This is a beautiful Venlo house, very high technology Venlo house, and the Ortley family gave us 6.3 acres of land, and we removed the warehouses on it and built this greenhouse. So we have the greenhouse on the land, and we're starting to use that facility now. So this gives us about 13,500 square feet of nursery space dedicated to mission-related plants that we can get into the living collection. And so as we think about things, and we've moved from, so it's easy for gardens and you as a homeowner to actually, you want a plant, you can go to your local store, you can go to Bears, you can go to Home Depot, you can grab a plant, you can put it in the ground, you can order online from a catalog. That's a little bit different for us. If we've got all of these goals that we're trying to achieve to be able to get that plant into the ground, we actually have to go and collect them. So this slide just shows the difference between ordering and planting versus actually then going out into the wild. So we need to back up the planning 2 to 3 to 4 years to be able to understand how long these plants take in production, to be able to get them into the garden, to make that relevance really key. And so part of the new nursery gives us that ability to do that, so we can then begin to back up 3 to 4 years, develop and collect these plants, grow them out, and then add them into the living collection. And so we're getting to the point where we can now do that, which is a very exciting point for us to get to. But the new nursery is also more than that as well. As we bring these important plants into the collection, we need to continue to keep them alive in the collection, so we need to repropagate them. So we have to have space to be able to do that, and expertise. We're able then to grow critically plants of critical conservation concern and be able to produce those for living collections. We're able to grow plants that we spend years pruning. So things like in the Japanese garden, those bonsais there don't just happen over a few years. Those are decades of pruning. So if we lose one, which we did in this storm, where are we going to replace that from? Well, we've got to try and go and find one and start to train it. We can hold it at the nursery, prune it for 5 or 10 years, get it to a shape, and then add it when we lose one. So it gives us much more flexibility. We can then do schedule replacements of things like hedges and other core elements of the garden. And so the nursery gives us the ability then to really be able to bring the full power of propagation and production into supporting the living collections for us. And we've never really had that ability with the resources that we've had in the Hort division previously. So this is a great addition to our ability to do that. So the future of the hardy plant nursery is this structure here. And so as we're building and still fundraising for, this is what we're calling the head house. And it's more than just a head house. This integrates all of those things that we were talking about. So as we start talking about the mission of the garden and being able to deliver that mission, the head house has micropropagation facilities. The head house has a seed bank with a concrete protected seed vault. The head house has the ability for us to be able to do traditional traditional potting on this end of the head house as well. So it's all of these pieces and parts together in one spot so that we can bring a plant in, we can assess its viability from seed, we can assess its storage protocols, we can store it away if we've got mass amounts of it, make sure we keep it alive in the living collection in the seed bank. We can propagate some of it, add propagation protocols to that information. We can grow it on and then add it to the living collection, or alternatively it can go through micropropagation. So all of these things, this is the melding of all of these things together that allow us to support the garden's mission to a very, very high level. So we're very excited with the new nursery and the new facilities to be able to do that. So the seed bank. The seed bank did not exist 8 years ago. So how are we doing so far? We've got a greenhouse, we've got 6.3 acres of land, we're getting there on the new Hardy Plant Nursery, we've got one of the world's most advanced living collections management systems, and we've got a seed bank with 27% of Missouri's flora in it in 8 years. So not bad. We've got 160 rare specimens in the seed bank, and then the two goals of the seed bank. One is to conserve the entirety of Missouri's flora, so we can make sure that no species in Missouri will ever go extinct. So we're collecting from Missouri's flora. So we have 27% of the flora. Big job, not there yet. We've got to collect from multiple populations. And then we're also adding in seed from various areas of the world to support the garden's programs across the globe. So it supports both research and horticulture programs. And so we have around 847 species in our seed bank right now. So seed bank is functional. We're going to move it to the new Hardy Plant Nursery and then allow it to integrate with all of the processes that we're doing there very soon, as soon as that building is operational. We've conducted quite a few international field trips. We do regular field trips to the US to collect those species for the seed bank. We've gone to Mauritius to collect species like this cylindrocline here. Didn't get here on its own. We brought it back. This is pictures from Tanzania. So we're field collecting for this, which is the Coromia gygas. This is a really funny picture because we were in this vehicle here, and one of the vehicles didn't end up. One of the vehicles actually went wrong, and they had to leave the village. And so there was 2 vehicles worth of staff and 1 vehicle to get us out of there. So, and you can imagine collecting supplies, pole pruners, herbarium presses, the whole works, right? And so we all had to cram in to this vehicle. And so, yoga poses around. So I am an aerobics instructor, apparently, so we can, around herbarium specimens. And then they said, wait, we forgot the chicken. I said, what do you mean the chicken? So the villagers gifted Yaya here a chicken. So we had 8 people and a chicken. So that was funny. And so this is Alana training folks from the Bishkek Botanic Garden how to use the collector app to track and record this malus Nidoitsiana, which is critically endangered. And they brought back over 5,000 seeds from that expedition. So you can see those seeds here in Kyrgyzstan. They made their way into the garden seed bank, and are now being propagated to put into the living collection. So you will see examples of those in the living collection. So integration, so all together. And then we also do, we've also used our horticultural knowledge not just to support plants, although this is the core of what we do. We always want to come back to the plant itself. But we also use our horticultural knowledge to do things like master planning, database and tracking, and other things that we do as part of our daily jobs at managing the collections. So we've been to all of these places in the last 8 years as integrating that work that we do. And we're building the ability to increase that based on the target zone. So we're moving towards being able to target more of those areas in the collections to bring more species back into the living collection. The College of Horticulture. We wanted to develop a College of Horticulture to be able to then offer training for local and global participants to be able to support our horticulture. So far, we've established a relationship with the university. We've got a research firm doing studies on the viability of this from the standpoint of asking students whether there's a market for this. We've done studies across different botanic gardens saying, would you employ these folks that we produce from training programs. And the idea is that we integrate both practical and academic. So horticulture, you can study science, and horticulture is science-based. It's a core to what we understand. So we have to understand how these plants grow, how they uptake in nutrients, how the vascular system works in the plant, the cells. So we have to understand all that to understand how to grow a plant. But we also have to understand which end of the shovel is the right end to put in the ground, right? And so you have to, horticulture is a very, very practical entity, and it's that connection between practical and science knowledge that generates what we're able to do. And so we see it very much as an apprenticeship program and a highly scientific academic program. So we combine the two, where students work for us and get trained in high-level sciences. And this will then enable folks to understand the curation of plant collections and understand the importance and mission of botanic gardens to be able to then to go out and do the work that's so critical nowadays with our horticulture. So we want to re-establish that, and so we're getting to the point now where we may be able to offer that in 2020. I need to see what that report from those consultants are, but we've produced 14 curriculums, so we're very, very close. So we may have a college in 2020. Some of you within Kemper that volunteer for Kemper may have seen this. But we're looking at being able to then put that horticultural information out through the Kemper Center. So again, it's all integrated, so the knowledge of growing these plants then gets out to the public through, if we learn how to propagate something, we want to share that with you guys. We want to share how to prune something through the Kemper Center's programs. And one of the things that we're seeing is a shift in the way that people digest information. We now got 20 million online visits to our Plant Finder information system, which is pretty significant. And we get 21,000 questions a year. And so this is going in February. It is an addition to the center of the building, which will then integrate both plant pest and disease identification and visitor greeting in one spot within the center of the building. And then we're looking at digital resources to be able then to much more interactive displays within the Kemper Center to be able to deliver that horticulture information. And then alongside looking at the Kemper Center went in 20 years ago, so we want to understand if the same principles are there. What do you want to know horticulturally? Do you want to know the best hedging plants for the city? Do you want to know which perennials we should plant in which seasons? What is it you want to know horticulturally? And so that will then dictate some of the gardens that are created in the Kemper Center and that connection between the building going forward. And so we're working on the Kemper Center's programs to increase that information delivery. So what does all this mean for landscapes on the garden's grounds, right? He's talked for an hour and he's not even talked about landscapes on the garden's grounds. Oh my gosh, what kind of horticulturist is he? A botanical horticulturist, right? So what this means is that we want to integrate all of these things. When we think about a display, we're thinking about integration of all of these types of interpretive values: conservation use, land use, propagation and cultivation, ethnobotanical use, so that we can tell the story of the plant. But we do have some limitations. I see Tyre over there somewhere. This is a native plant landscaping, and of course we can't do this with our living collections because we can't track the individual plant groups. So if we mix plants in like this, we cannot track the individual. And so that's one type of landscape display that we cannot do on the garden's grounds. That's why you don't see it too much. So Pierre Laroff, that you'll see if you come in for his presentation, this is what he does. We can't do that, because we need to be able to contain the plants, track the information according to them, and plant them in groups so that we can continue to maintain that information. So that's one limitation of what we do. And then, of course, we're talking about integrating annuals into key designated areas, but then also devoting large areas to collections that can support the wider mission of the garden. And so what you'll see happen over time, over years, because botanic gardens collections happen slowly, right? It takes 4 years to grow something, 2 years to put it into the garden's grounds. You're seeing more and more diversity added to the living collections. So we'll switch from perhaps having a few species hold up a display to mass diversity holding up that, creating that flowering over long periods of time. So more plants, more flowers, longer flowering seasons, more diversity, more interesting plants for all of you to see. So that's what's going to happen to the landscapes over time. So how have you guys supported us through all of this? And you know, one of the amazing things is that we've got so much support here at the garden from all of you, from internally, from the horticulture division, and so these are tools and equipment that have been supported through gifts from all of our plant societies and individuals. And we've got things like very accurate GPS trackers, so that we can give you a specific GPS point down to a few feet on this in Tanzania, in the field. We've got collections vehicles so that we can go and drive up, I was going to say a mountain in Missouri, but that's probably not a correct thing to say, but into a wet area or into up the side of a mountain to be able to collect some of these plants locally. We do things like tracking things with drones in the garden. So we map and track our collections. We use drones to fly out. We will be using drones to fly out and understand where plants occur so that we don't have to hike up the side of the mountain. So we can see if a species is there ahead of us before we get to it. So we are very much into using high technology. This is a 2-pin lift for pruning a lot of our trees, an air spade for reducing compaction on the garden's grounds. So all of these tools have allowed us to actually improve the quality of the garden's grounds, and they have come from donations. This is a sat phone, so if you do get stuck out in the middle of nowhere, you can call home or call for an ambulance, whatever. And so what is it we want for the future of the garden here? We want to continue to move forward on these projects that we've got. And so I'm very, very excited to be able to focus the full power of all of these changes that we've made recently on achieving that goal. I sound like something out of Star Wars, right? Focus the full power. But if we can focus all of these modern initiatives that we've come up with to be able then to focus that, the Hardy Plant Nursery is coming online. We've got the Living Collections Management System to track and record this data. We're actually focusing on targeting collections. We've got the College of Horticulture coming online. So all of these pieces together are making for a very strong platform. I used to put a slide up with a launch of a space shuttle saying where we were on building this platform and fueling the space shuttle. And then I accidentally used it in a presentation in Russia, and I got a so-so response because, of course, the space race and stuff. Oh, why did I do that? Okay. So I've taken that slide out now. But we're almost there where we're filling the gas tank here. So we've got all of these pieces. So we want to complete the Hardy Plant Nursery, all of that specialist equipment in the building. We need to do that, and we're actively fundraising for that right now. We need to get the College of Horticulture education programs up and running. And we need to complete this. One of the future goals for the LCMS, of course, now we've got one of the leading systems in the world. We're not going to stop at that. We want to know what's in everybody else's collections now. So if we can know what's in everybody else's collections, then we can spot gaps. And so we're pulling in all this information. We're also very excited by the World Flora Online data, for example, so that we can understand that taxonomy. So all of these pieces are things that we want to finish up. And then these are aspirational things. We want to run 5 international expeditions per year, run 5 national expeditions, add about 1,500 species to the living collection, and add 500 species from actually field expeditions, 500 species from exchanges, and then work with 250 critically endangered species like these with our horticulture. And then enhance the capacity for us to do this full circle while displaying the plants in the garden. So how can you support our mission and do support our mission? Supporting enhancing facilities. If you want to make a gift, the gift to the Hardy Plant Nursery allows us to grow more plants. It's as simple as that. So we can integrate all those expertise. We depend on everybody for innovative tools and equipment, and that's really, really important. And we're looking at really establishing long-term endowments and gifts. And so we're moving away from perhaps looking at landscape and saying, okay, you're going to donate to a landscape, more towards saying, okay, there's a mission behind this stuff, and it's about the conservation of the plants. Yes, it is about delivering the beautiful landscape, but there's all of this richness behind it as well. So when we're asking for donations, we're saying, understand that we've got to go and get this plant. We've got to safeguard this plant. And so that's part of it too. And so all of this stuff comes together. And so we're looking at endowing the ability to go out and do these field collections and be advocates for us. You know, understand that we are a botanical garden, understand the mission behind the garden, and go out and talk about it. We want people to understand and care about plants, and come volunteer for us as well. And more than anything, please enjoy the plants in our landscapes that we produce. Any questions? I'm not ready to say that yet, but I will say that the college is, the university is very, very excited to partner with us, and they are great partners. And so, but I can't quite divulge the name of the university yet. But
Could you share where are the top 5 schools of horticulture currently?
Well, that's a difficult question because you know, it depends on what you're talking about. The traditional horticultural colleges in the United States are things like Michigan, Florida, and San Luis Obispo in California, and so those are traditional horticultural colleges in the United States. But this combination of both academic and practical that we're talking about doesn't really exist in many programs. And so the only programs that I know of that exist are the program that I went through at the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, which is a very niche program. The Royal Botanic Gardens Edinburgh, the National Botanic Garden of Ireland, and so there are several programs in Europe, but the United States really doesn't have a program like this right now.
Missouri Botanical Gardens concentrated in certain parts of the world. Is the whole world covered right now by different other gardens?
Not necessarily. You know, we work together with other institutions in some of those areas in the world as well. You know, we can't necessarily conserve every species in every region that we work in, but we collaborate with other botanic gardens, and so by no means the whole world is covered. And also, you know, one of the debates we have in botanic gardens is we'll call it an inequity of resources in various different areas of the world. And so you have the United States and Europe, of course, very rich in resources, and then you have those developing countries that have very few resources. And so many of the plant species that occur in those tropical regions, the highly diverse regions, have very, very few botanic gardens in them. And I think that's even more a role for us to say that we actually then have a responsibility from ourselves to be able to then go and help some of these others out, to be able to increase the skill level, to be able to produce that backbone to support that development of conservation, because we're so dependent upon plant species across the globe, not just our own native plant species here, but also plant species that occur around the world. So it's very important that we do that. So by no means we've not got full coverage. But if you do, I did the math just to figure it out, if every botanic garden around the world took 55 plants under their wing and said that we were going to stop to conserve this plant species, we could conserve every plant species that was likely to go extinct in the next 50 years. So the math is possible. Of course, you've probably only got 500 institutions out of those institutions with the capacity to do so. And so then we're talking a few more species, and our goal of 250 perhaps want to be one of the larger botanic gardens in the world. So we should take on more of a burden of that to be able to help. So it's technically possible that all botanic gardens can work together to support plant conservation.
Is there also an effort within the botanical gardens to understand why these plants become rare or vulnerable?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of it too. You have to understand what's going on with that plant. So that's integral to the work. So for instance, in some of the slides in Kyrgyzstan, it's grazing, it's habitat destruction. So in order to understand how to recover that plant, you have to figure that stuff out as you go as well. So it's all integrated into the process. So we have to understand whether those areas are protected or not. And so yeah, it's part of it that we understand those things. Sometimes we can like in Madagascar, they've been successful at creating some of these nature reserves, and the garden's been instrumental in conserving the species in situ. Other places we can't do that, and we have to go and essentially grab the plants, move them out in ex situ and propagate them and make sure we safeguard them until we can put them back. It depends on how that habitat's going to change over time based on our strategy. So we think about that, yeah, all the time.
Andrew, it was very great to hear the mission and the thought process going on in the Missouri Botanical Garden. I appreciated that, just to understand that there was thought behind this, and it's not just. What about between the gardens, the warm gardens themselves? You're trying to collect all these endangered species. Do you organize that effort? So you participate efforts?
There is a lot, and we talk to one another continuously to try and figure out who's got what and how we can work. But one of the things that's really stopping us, and this is where we really start to understanding about what each other have, is that we're on the cusp of being able to have that data. So right now we can see what the world's botanic gardens have that they've shared data of, but we cannot see the full information associated to each one of those species. And so one of the goals that we want to try and do, working with the Botanic Gardens Conservation International, is develop their database. We have some very fantastic database developers here that have done Tropicos and our Living Collections database system. And we want to help them develop a system called Plant Finder. Plant Finder is a database of all the world's Botanic Gardens collections, but we don't just want to know whether a botanic garden has something, which is what the data shows right now. We want to know where it's from, how much representation is in those gardens collections, and then we can begin to say, we're the only ones with Coromia gigas, we better share it with you, or we better figure out the gap in this collection. So we're getting there with that ability to do that. And we've been writing some grants this last year to grant funders to achieve that project. That's a rather large project, so it's going to take us a little bit of time, but we see the future of that. And that follows really on from the World Flora Online project, which is the big push of the garden here, taxonomically, to understand the diversity of plants in one online platform that then can become the backbone to understand the taxonomy. And then if we understand the rarity of these species and where they are in botanic gardens, then we have all the triad of pieces together to be able then to work towards better together to be able to conserve those plant species. Thank you.